So thank you very much for coming, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I am very happy to be here in Melbourne, and I'm very pleased that my gracious host, Greg Carter of the Victorian AIDS Commission, is sitting in the audience. Thank you for coming, Greg. I hope you are a little bit enlightened by what I'm about to share. Greg, when I shared some of what was happening in the Caribbean in terms of the response to LGBT rights, was shocked because the image that most people have of the Caribbean is one of sand, sea, and sun, and no problem, man. Let it all hang out and smoke a joint and be fine. But the reality for the average LGBT or sex worker or drug user is very, very different, because what most people imagine of the Caribbean is a very stylized reality that is only available in the precincts of resorts behind high walls where you never ever actually meet the population. So this is what's happening in the beyond those walls. The level of homophobia in Jamaica right now is averaging about 85%. The level of HIV among men who have sex with men in Jamaica is the highest in the Western Hemisphere. 1 in 3 MSM has HIV. Okay, there's a direct correlation. I worked for an organization called AIDS-Free World, and up to the end of June, and they issued a statement, which I think is still very relevant, that one of the challenges to addressing this homophobia and therefore addressing the level of HIV prevalence is the existence of anti-gay laws, which are relics from the colonial past. The anti-sodomy law in Jamaica is from 1864. And in the Anglophone Caribbean, we're the only countries in the Western Hemisphere that still have those laws. And they range in terms of severity from 10 years in Jamaica to life in prison in Barbados. In Belize and Trinidad, gays are actually banned from entering those countries. That's what the law says. Okay? They might not be regularly enforced, but they certainly are available as tools of discretion. And the reality is that the laws support a culture of intolerance, discrimination, stigmatization. We recently challenged the immigration law in Belize and Trinidad, and when we were in court, the lawyer for the government of Trinidad said the law was necessary to keep out terrorists. All right, so the aim of AIDS-Free World in the Caribbean was to challenge the anti-gay laws, the homophobia, and the idea is that by getting rid of the laws, we then also need to implement a regime of anti-discrimination legislation. But that's a long way off. So the responses that we have taken to challenge the level of homophobia have not only been legislative, they've also involved social interventions, high-level dialogue, and I'll just quickly go through some of them. The first thing we did was we identified the levels and drivers of homophobia in the Caribbean, which are primarily religious and cultural. We have also engaged in human rights documentation and advocacy training. We've engaged in a program of LGBT sensitivity training for police, but we've quickly realized that that has to expand to include sensitivity training for police, media workers, healthcare workers, prison warders, on issues relating to sex work and drug use as well. So we're trying a variety of strategies. We've also done public advocacy, stands, marches, etc., to try and raise the visibility, because the complicating factor in small islands is that there's very little space for LGBT or sex workers or drug users to be visible without repercussions. There's nowhere to escape to. It's as simple as that, So we're very fortunate we have some allies, like this 78-year-old woman who is very happy to come and join our protest march. But that we're raising the profile because we realize that it's visibility of any marginalized group that will help to reduce the level of intolerance and indifference towards that group. We also tried to air ads calling for tolerance for LGBTI people, and the response from the television stations was that to air those ads would be aiding and abetting an illegal activity. So we weren't successful. We've done high-level diplomacy. We've met with the ambassadors, the officials, etc. And the response has always been at the international level. Yes, we get it. We need to repeal the laws. And there's one particular prime minister who shall remain nameless, who is very famous, and he's from the Caribbean, and he's in charge of the HIV response. But again, he shall remain nameless. Who is infamous for going to international fora and saying, oh yes, we should get rid of these laws, and we will. And by the time he's back in the Caribbean, he's on the platform using his that space to condemn gays and use it for gay baiting for political purposes. But I never mentioned his name, did I? So no one can say I called him. And the impact of all of these interventions has been muted, because we realize that at the international level, they want to present us face of being open, inclusive, tolerant. It's an economic imperative. We depend on tourism. But when it comes to what's happening on the ground, they are beholden to the very conservative evangelical churches. They're very, very subject to the whims of the churches. So there's very limited space for them to actually do anything politically to get rid of the intolerance and stuff. We've appealed to international bodies. We have used the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, a fair deal. We have founded the first organization in the Caribbean that is dedicated to the rights of LBT, lesbian, bisexual, and trans women. We've done a documentary on the impact of homophobia. We have reported unethical behavior, such as when newspapers and multinational corporations sponsor, homophobic performances. We've really tried to address the issue in a multiplicity of ways. We've established the first organization dedicated to responding to LGBT homelessness. We have a situation in Jamaica where LGBT youth as young as 10 years old are kicked out of their homes because they are gender non-conforming. They're forced to live in sewers because every abandoned building that they stayed in was torn down, and the police kicked them out. And the kids are now selling sex to survive. They're paid extra for condom-less sex. And the last time we tested these kids, 90% of them were HIV positive. And they're having sex with married men. Okay? So you can imagine the implications for the bridging of the HIV epidemic. So this is the context in which we work. It's a very tight space to work in, because the church is incredibly powerful. Some of the legal challenges we have engaged in, we've challenged the law in Jamaica which criminalizes same-gender intimacy before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And that case will only result in a non-binding recommendation for the country to repeal the law. We're hoping to have a decision in the next 2 years, but it will still be non-binding because it's not a court, it's just a commission. Right? But why we are happy for it is that that case will be able to set precedent for the 35 countries in the Americas that still recognize the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Venezuela et al. Have been trying to denounce the commission from time to time, but for now, the 35 countries in the Americas still recognize the Inter-American Commission, and that will set precedent. We also challenge the television stations when they refuse to air a tolerance ad, and on the grounds, as I said, that they said the ad would be aiding and abetting an illegal activity. We lost the case, predictably, because the courts are very conservative. And the only benefit we found from that case was it was the first time we'd actually litigated in our courts the issue of LGBT rights. And the president of the panel, although ruling against us on every point, did say that the charter was meant to protect LGBT people, even though it doesn't specifically mention LGBT people. But then she proceeded to ignore the claim. But you sometimes have to lose to win. So it was the first court recognition that we have a right to exist, to be protected by the charter. We've also challenged the law the anti-sodomy law domestically. So we've challenged it at the level of the Inter-American Commission. We've also challenged it within our own jurisdiction. And that court case is expected to be heard November 10 to 21. And it has become a media circus. We have 13 religious groups that have piled on to oppose the repeal of the anti-sodomy law. And the way we've framed it is very narrowly. We're just saying we want the right to be able to engage in private acts of intimacy. Not marriage, not adoption, just private intimacy between consenting adults. And the churches have said if the law's repeal is going to lead to curtailing of their right to freedom of religion, freedom of speech, they will not be able to condemn gays anymore, boys will be raped, the most ridiculous and preposterous arguments you could possibly imagine. And sadly, these are not arguments that are being raised by insignificant members of the society. We have 4 Queen's Counsel, including the former Attorney General of Jamaica, who is representing the churches. Okay? There's an investment in keeping this law that boggles the mind, and we can discuss whether it's an influence of North American advances or global North advances in terms of marriage equality, etc., and that's setting back the right movement in the Caribbean. We can have that discussion, but that's where we are. We have also challenged the immigration law in Belize and Trinidad. Because, again, as I said, the law bans the entry of homosexuals. And as a gay man, my job is to travel around the region doing advocacy. But I am unable to do that if I am going to Belize and Trinidad. I would be breaking the law. And as a lawyer, I refuse to do that. So that case we will hopefully hear in the next year. The court did something remarkable, frankly. They didn't dismiss the hearing of the matter, which we fully expected them to do. They actually granted us leave to bring this case. Because based on the decision in the TV case, we thought, the immigration case would go nowhere, but they actually granted us leave. And they said the existence of a law in the Caribbean which bans the movement of LGBT people is, what's the word? I'm trying to find the exact phrasing, but basically it demonstrates a level of prejudice, okay, which is very obvious, you would think, but for the Caribbean, that's revolutionary that the courts have actually used that language in relation to discrimination against LGBT people, because it was always thought to be natural. I mean, we're criminals, aren't we? We've also challenged the law in Belize, which criminalizes same-gender intimacy. So we've challenged the immigration law, which bans the entry of gays, and we've challenged the law in Belize, which bans same-gender intimacy. And that decision we're expecting, hopefully, within the next couple months, because it's been pending for a year and something. Case was heard over a year ago, and the judge has still not rendered his decision. So the fact is, our charter in Jamaica does not allow for easy challenges of these laws. People would think, well, just challenge the law. It's so homophobic. Why don't you just bring a case? Well, in Jamaica, we have a particular convention which says that the laws dealing with same-gender intimacy cannot be challenged in any local court. Okay? They also have a ban on challenging laws about abortion and what they call obscene publications. We cannot challenge these laws in our local courts. We think we have found a way, which is why we launched the cases, clearly. But it's going to be a difficult case because the Constitution seems very clear. These laws are meant to be preserved in perpetuity. Okay? That's the impact of the evangelical churches. Another case, quote unquote, which I should have mentioned, but I'm sorry I didn't. The youngsters who are living in the sewers, these LGBT youth were constantly being evicted by the police and had to return there because they had nowhere else to go. We went to court on March 4, and the judge said that the youngsters have a right to live in the sewers because it's a public space. And that's a victory for us in the Caribbean. All right? So I've discussed the cases, and I'm going to make these slides available. These are just the facts of the cases, and we can discuss, the likelihood of success during the question and answer of these cases. And the last thing I want to briefly mention is What have been the results of some of these initiatives, the advocacy, the cases, etc.? Well, we've begun to see positive editorials in the newspapers, which is a first. We've seen politicians actually make supportive statements about LGBT people. There's been a marginal decrease in homophobia. We've seen academics go against each other. This is one son versus the father, challenging their homophobic perceptions in the media and in public discourse, which is wonderful. The Minister of Health has said very positive things, that cultural religious beliefs drive stigma and discrimination. They need to go. We've seen our musicians come out, and we've also had backlash. We've had the first public marches against LGBT rights in the country. This is the headline, No to Homo Agenda. That was June 29th this year. We've had ads linking LGBT rights with HIV, very blatantly. US and North American and global North pastors, evangelicals have come to the Caribbean in droves to push homophobia. And they've published a lot of material to say, we're recognizing our rights will lead to the end of civilization as we know it. We've responded, of course, with facts, trying to be as nuanced as possible. And we've learned some very critical lessons. And this is where I'll end. We must be credible. Our data must be consistent. We must be creative. We must be consistent on what we say, but we must also be flexible, be visible, be a voice for all vulnerable groups, and be vulnerable ourselves, so that we have to share our stories if we want to advance the agenda. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions afterwards.